So let's see. So what we were doing was, remember we had, like in the last class, we did the uh, deployment for the file system, right? And you go in the bin and you go to the deployment and you say, okay, I want to deploy using this deployment manifest, right? So we did the file system deployment for the SQL Server deployment, or SQL Server deployment. What you need to do is, if you have to connect to the integration services, if I try to connect now from here and look for this one and try to connect, we are getting this error, right? So what you can do is open the management studio as an admin, that's gonna solve it. So right click on open the SQL Server Management Studio, right click and say run as administrator. So I think this is one of the Windows things. It needs the admin privilege even though you're admin for that server, which doesn't make sense. So when yeah, so you run as an admin and then you do the same thing that you're doing and do like click connect to the integration services, and in here you're gonna connect to the same server, and this time it's gonna connect. See, okay, so you run the SQL Server as admin, and then you see in here in the integration services instance you don't have any project deployed right now, so we're gonna deploy the packages in the SQL Server itself. So what's the advantage of deploying SQL packages on the SQL Server instance integration services, or putting in the file system, the security wise? So if you're storing password, you're doing in the XML file in the packages, right? So instead what you do is, so no one can look into the package who don't access, you deploy those packages onto the SQL Server. It's just the enhanced security. You're not putting into your drives. You're directly deploying on the integration services server. Okay, so how do you do the deployment is, once you know this is a server name, what we're going to do is, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to right click and say open this one. Okay, integration services deployment. I'm going to click next and I'm going to select the SQL Server deployment in here. Okay, I click next. In here I have to type my server name. So either I can get it from here. Oops, I have two of them open. Or I can do is go in here and get the server name with the integration services, which is this one, right? So I get my server instance name for the integration services, put it here. Okay, once you put it, you're using the Windows authentication, and then when you click in here, if you are able to access, then it's going to open the path where you want to deploy your packages. Okay, so it's basically the package path. It's going to open up in your if you have access to the server. Once you're able to maybe let's see, I'm gonna just do a disconnect from here. Maybe that's the problem sometime. So I'm gonna do is, in here in the stored packages, you can create a new folder. Okay, and I'm gonna say the name is SSIS data warehouse, and this is all for the package deployment. Okay, SSIS data warehouse. I click OK. So I'm gonna have the folder in here created. Okay, and then I can disconnect this one, and now let's try to connect. What is going on? Oh, okay. So just I'm gonna do the server name as is, and then now let's try to connect if it picks up. Okay, because it's not working as that, but I'm gonna try this way. Yes, so it picked up this one, and then it doesn't show the folder that we created. So let's say for now I'm gonna put the packages directly in here. Okay, in the SSIS packages I'm gonna put it, but usually you have a way where you can create a folder. Okay, let's see. So let's try one more time. Let's connect to the integration services, connect, and then in here probably you have to say it's we created the folder in the wrong place. Okay, that's why I cannot see it. So if I create in here and I say SSIS data warehouse, I'm gonna see the same folder in there now. Okay, so in here I have the folder SSIS data warehouse. Okay, so now if I try to cancel and do a refresh, I have the folder in here. Okay, so I'm gonna pick this folder and I'm gonna click next. Click next. Once you have the path, and then you're just gonna leave this as is. You don't need to change anything in here. You click next. Couldn't create a C. Yeah. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the path because it's saying that it doesn't have access to this folder. The one I'm doing it right now, it doesn't have access. So I'm just going to put for now for the deployment, I'm going to put it in my E drive or somewhere, you know. So this PC, I'm going to put it in the E drive for now and click OK. All right. Once I click OK, I'm going to click next. So what is happening is it's saying that the folder that was by default, which is in here in the server, it doesn't have access. It's the problem for the Windows, but you shouldn't be having it. So I'm just going to put in the E drive for now, and then I'm going to click next, and it's going to install all the packages on the server into that location. Okay, so I think once you do this, it's going to ask there is a configuration file, and what's the configuration for the value. So I'm just going to leave this DTS config for the master package. Do you remember we had the config file for the master package? It's asking, do you want to set any values when you're doing the deployment in here? So let's say when you do the deployment on the production, you can put the config value in here. When you deploy into the test, you can put the corresponding value for that packages, you know. So you put the corresponding value and you do the deployment and you finish. So once you finish, you're gonna have all your packages in here. Where it is. So see, all of the packages are in here, right? The ones that we created inside the project. So that is nothing but just the SQL Server deployment. And now you have is in here. So once you deployed the packages on the server, you have to create the job, right? So you can schedule the job in the SQL Server agent via like how we did in the last class, right? We have seen how to configure the job for the packages. So you can call in the SQL Server agent these packages to run it overnight. Okay, so that's what the SQL Server deployment is usually. So we have seen how can you do the package configuration, right? And then we have seen how can you deploy the packages in a package deployment model two ways, either the file system or the SQL Server deployment. Once you have the deployment, then you're going to create the jobs on the SQL Server agent so that it will run every midnight or so, or over, whatever the schedule that you have created. Okay, so that would be it for doing the deployment of the package deployment model. Okay, so now once we're done with the package deployment model, what I want you to do is I want you to cover for the project, do finish on the so try to work on the project and try to do the deployment for the packages that you have created by creating the configurations, right? So because we're not going to meet on the next class, right? On this one we will be out, right? So when we meet on next Tuesday, if you can have the configuration done for the package configuration. So what you can do is, I can tell you what configuration that you can try. You can do is, you can have the SQL Server configuration for the packages. Okay, have the SQL Server configuration for the packages, and then we will try to work on that. So create a separate copy and then do this configurations. Okay, on the separate copy. So do you want to do the SQL Server configuration? I think that would be the best you usually doing. That would be the good idea to do it. So do the so do the SQL Server configuration for the packages, and then for the config table, do either the environment variable or do the XML configuration file, whichever you prefer, for pointing to the or the XML configuration for pointing to the configuration table for the SQL Server configuration table. So you can use either of that. Okay. So once we do deployment for that in the next class, probably after that a week and a half from now, or like, we're gonna see the project deployment thing. Okay, how can you deploy using the project deployment model? Okay, and now in here what we have left is, so usually in the control flow task we have covered most of the tasks that you're using for the SSIS. There are certain tasks that are available that you not gonna much use, which are more related to fuzzy grouping. It's more for the data cleansing, which is like totally separate thing. So if you heard of data cleansing, when you have like duplicate rows in your databases, lots of duplicates, and you're trying to match, when you do the address matching, that's where you need these kind of transformation. Okay, so this SSIS is just not for the transformation, it's used for the data cleansing, it's used for the mining queries, which is DMQ, it's used for those as well. So there are certain transformations that are used. So basically this fuzzy grouping, or those you see, is usually, let's say in the database you have a person and you getting the addresses for the same person from different sources, and for that person, let's say you have two different you have two addresses, but it's similar address. So in, let's say, sometime what happens is they type New York, and then in the other one they do New York with space, you know. So you try to do match and say, okay, these two are the same values. So that's where, when you do the data cleansing, that's where you use these kind of logics for cleansing up the data, but that's you're not going to use for the data warehouse purpose. That's totally separate. So basically when you are getting the address for the campaign or for the advertisement, and then you have to make sure that one person is not campaigned twice or three times, because you're getting the source. So you try to merge the source, and that's where you use those things. Okay, this row sampling is very useful. So let's say when you have millions of rows, okay, and then let's say you're loading the fact package, right? And when you're loading the fact package, what do you want to do is, you want to just get from the sales order detail and sales order header table. You just want to do not all the rows, 10% or first 1,000 rows. Either you can do the top 10. When you do the top 10, it always gonna get you the same rows. But when you use the row sampling, it always gonna get you the different rows. So it's gonna go to the table and pick for 10% rows for you. So it's gonna do the random selection for the rows, so that when you're running the package every time in your dev, it's not gonna pick the same rows. So the chances are getting an error in the package, if it's gonna occur, would be higher in using the row sampling, right? So because you're not gonna run your package on the same data set every time you pick the data. Let's say you're picking just the 10% of your number of rows you have in the table. Every time it would be shuffling, and then you can come across, okay, different data set to run the package. Because in the dev, if you have, let's say, or in the test, if you have 10 million rows, you're not gonna sit and test the package for the 10 million rows. You usually do is you just take the 10%, because the tests are not gonna sit for 3 hours and run the package, you know. So they usually do is like the row sampling. So the row sampling would be useful when you have the row coming from the sales order detail table. Let's see, right? Does it make sense why the row sampling would be needed? So you don't want to process all the data that you have, you're just trying to get some data. So let's say if I do the source assistant, and then let's pick yes, or that just for the testing, not even exploring the data, just for the testing. when you're testing, you don't want to run through whole data set. You have 10 million rows in the test. You don't want to go through 10 million, but you want to go every time you run the package, you want to go through a different set of sampling, you know. So that's where it helps. So what it's going to do is it's going to read all the rows, but think about when you're running all the 10 million rows through your fact table where you have lots of lookups, right? It's going to take a lot of time. But let's say you read all data and then you pick random sample from your data source. So in here it's going to do the random sampling for you, basically picking up the rows randomly, like 10% or 10 rows or 100 rows or 1000 rows, whatever you mention. So it just helps every time you're running the testing package in the testing, it's going to pick the different rows. So the chances of failing on the same data set is less as compared to the different data set every time, you know, because you're going to come across different scenarios when you have different data set. So all you do is you pick the data source, you say, okay, my connection to you enable, I mean, like you do this one and then you pick I'm just gonna pick sales order detail, click OK, and then in the row sampling you need to say how many number of rows you want. Okay, do you want 10 number of rows, do you want 100, do you want 1000? Okay, and that's what you can do. And then you say the sample output name and then the unselected. So you don't, I mean, you see, like when you have a no match and match, so it's the same thing, the sampled ones and the unsampled one, I mean like the remaining ones. Okay, the rows goes in here. Now you can use this one, use the following random seed that would if you're generating your own data set, you know. So let's say if you use this one, it's going to always generate the same data. So let's say if you want the same number of rows every time, so let's say when you're doing the testing, okay, and then when you're running this the package, it failed, and then when you try to run it again, how do you know that it's gonna pass for the rows? Because it's randomly selecting. So let's say you fix the error, then how do you know then it got fixed? So basically if you put the seed in here, it's gonna give you the same number of rows for that number of times. So that once you make sure that, okay, I ran last time for the seed 10 and it failed, I again the seed for the rows for the seed 10, it should succeed because I fixed the problem. Because if you don't use this one, it's just gonna randomly run the data, and then next time you run it, you might fail, you might not fail, because you don't know if on the row which your package got failed is taken or not in the sample random selection. Okay, so that's why you use the random seed. Okay, so you have the row sampling and then you have the percentage as well. So this one only allows you to pick the number of rows in terms of it doesn't let you do the percentage. So here you have the percentage sampling. So that will do is you can say, okay, I want to do 10%. So in here you have to say exact number of rows, but in here in the percentage you can just say in terms of percent, I want to do 10% of the row sampling, and the same options you have in here for the random seed. Okay, all right. And sometimes this is also used for in the production. So let's say you're doing certain campaign, okay, and you have a campaign, but what you want to do is you want to send the campaign only to the random selection. So let's say you're doing a campaign and you have a target in your database, you have 1 million customers. So what you do is you fix your target that I want to reach only those customers that visited my store 100 times in a year, or like 10 times in a year, and that they purchased more than 5,000 worth in a year, and they live in this area. Okay, so you picked up about 50,000 customers from 1 million, but you're targeting only 10,000 people for the campaign. Okay, so out of 50,000, how are you going to pick the 10,000? So what you're going to do is you're going to do the row sampling, and you're going to say I want only 20,000 at the random. So that time you're going to get the random 20,000 people selected from the database. It can be used for that as well. Okay, this percent sampling or the row sampling. All right, so and the rest we are almost seen, like how to use the. Yes, go ahead. I think it's just for doing when you usually do the like operator. It's a like in the SSIS. So when you will be doing like, okay, I want to do a term where it has the term status in it, I want all those data values, so you're going to use the term lookup and the term extraction. So the term lookup will do a lookup on the column. So let's say you're gonna, so the term lookup and the lookup is the same thing. I mean, lookup and the term lookup is the same thing, but it's going to look for the particular string in that column. So it's a lookup itself. How do you use the lookup? You would be using in the same way, but you know, you try to avoid these kind of term lookup and everything, because most of in the data warehousing, but when you would be doing sample extraction or doing the finding the data that you need particularly from the table, then only you would need the term lookup. So let's say you have a table that has a book or something or pages in it, you know, in the database, or that contains paragraph, and you're looking for all those paragraph that contains bicycle. So then what you're going to do is, let's say if I go for production.product model illustration, and you're doing for in the product illustration column, you are looking for you're going to do a lookup on, let's say you have a column in here which contains the similar thing. So you're trying to do a term lookup. Okay, if any of the terms matches, I don't have the particular column in here, but you say, okay, if the if this thing occurs in this illustration, give me those ones. So it's just going to do a lookup on this column if it exists in here. It doesn't have to match exactly. When you do a lookup, it's going to match exactly, but in here it's just going to look for this particular value in this if it exists. So these are very slow because it has to parse through all the data as you have. So these are all the most of the things that you have are for campaign or the data cleansing purposes. All this, the term lookup, the fuzzy grouping things are all related to those when you're trying to do a data cleaning or cleansing. I guess. And we're gonna see is, I think we have to see like how to do a cache transform. I think, did we see the cache transform yet? We didn't see it, right? Yes, we didn't see the cache transform. Yes. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna use this one, and we're gonna do the lookup as well. I have to show you one thing in the lookup, the advanced thing that we didn't cover. So that's the main thing. So what do you do is the cache transform is basically, let's say you have the text file and then you have the data source, okay? And then what you can do is, let's say you have to do a lookup on the text file, okay? When you do the lookup, where you're looking up right now, you're looking up in the table, right? When you're doing a lookup, where are you looking up right now? In your dimension tables, right? So let's say you don't have a dimension table, you want to do a lookup on on a file that is txt. So what do you do is you load the data into the cache transform first, and then when you do a lookup, you're gonna use is, let me show you. When you do a lookup, what you're gonna do is, instead of OLEDB connection manager, you're gonna use the cache connection manager. So the connection that you're gonna create in here, you put the data in, you will be connecting to that cache. Okay, so basically what you're doing in here is you take the txt file, you put in the memory. That's what it's going to do. It's going to put the whole file in the memory, and then you say, okay, I'm going to connect to cache. That's my memory. So when you're doing these kind of transformation and you have huge txt files, it would need a lot of memory. That's the one disadvantage of it. The advantage is that you can do a fast lookup. You know, you don't have to put it in the table and worry about those things, but it uses a lot of memory. So that's the cache transform. So let's see, does it make sense what I'm trying to say? So when you do the cache transform, when you go to the connection, it's going to ask you which is the cache connection you're talking about. So I don't have the cache connection, but it's going to appear in here once I've created. So let's say what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new cache in here, and I say cache connection, I keep this same, and I'm going to say use the file cache, but I have to put before, I have to create the cache file before even doing that. So let's see, so we have to put the flat file in here to put it in the cache transform. Hold on. So okay, so let's say I'm gonna make a connection to the OLEDB, not OLEDB, fleet file source. Okay, so I put the fleet file source in here, and I'm gonna make a connection to one of the flat files. I'm gonna create a new connection, and I'm gonna read the file that we have for the sales, right? So let's say if I'm doing on the sales table or the sales for the Germany, okay, and I say the column is in the first row. How do you set up, right? So you're gonna set the files, you're reading the data which has about the sales data in it, right? Order date, due date, ship date. Okay, you go to the advanced column, you're seeing okay, all the columns are read through, and in here I'm gonna do the suggest types, but it's gonna fail. It's okay. So we leave the DTSTR for now, and we'll think about how to do the conversions on those. Okay, so you do create the connection, and you are getting all as a DTSTR. It can have the truncation for those right now, but what you do is then you put this thing into the connection cache manager. Now what you're gonna do is once you have the file read, and you're gonna say okay, now I'm gonna put the memory. So this transformation gonna put all the rows from the flat file source to the memory. So now you have to create a memory. You need to do the allocation to the memory. So you're gonna say in here, and you're gonna name that connection manager that would be connecting to memory. So I would say this is my sales data, okay, from the txt. So sales txt, I will name it as, and then you can say to the columns, and you're gonna say okay, I'm gonna use all these columns. Okay, so it will be automatically. So now once you put in the cache, you have to define the index position. Okay, so I'm gonna use the index position by, it has to be one of the column that is that can be used as a unique row. So I'm gonna use the sales order ID as an index position. So the data will be sorted on the sales order ID. Okay, so you're gonna put all these columns, sorry, the columns that you're getting from the table, you're putting in the memory. Okay, all right, so that's what you're gonna do, and you're gonna click OK. And sometime if so, it's gonna read all of these columns that are coming in, and then you just indexed on the sales order ID. Okay, that's the index position that will be used to sort the data. And now this is the one way of doing it. Okay, you're gonna do sales txt, and then you're gonna put everything into the memory. All right, so I'm putting all the columns in here, doing the mapping. It's gonna put everything into the memory. Click OK. It's putting now everything into the memory. Once I'm gonna run this, it's gonna be in the memory. So now one more thing. Sometimes there are the cache files. Okay, so what you do is if you have the cache files, you can use the file that are cache files, that CSW. You can use those files directly in here. So you don't need to, if you don't have txt, if you have .csw files, you can put them in here. You can browse, and then it will show you all the columns. You just need to put the index position, okay, for those. So the cache files are different than txt files. So when you're using those, you click in here and you say browse, and then you have to pick your .caw file for the cache file if you have. But if you are doing txt, you have to first load the txt, and then you're gonna create the connection. You don't need the, so with the txt file, you don't need to do this one. You just go in here, you put the index position, and that's it. Okay, so now what I'm gonna do is in the lookup, I'm gonna say okay, whatever in the source file, I have to do a lookup on the source file. So if you have to do a lookup on the source file, you're gonna go in the lookup, and you're gonna say I'm gonna do the lookup this time on the data that is in the cache, not in the table in the my database. It's this time this data is sitting in the cache. I'm gonna go to the connection, and it's already been selected because there's a connection. Now you're gonna go to the columns and then say okay, I'm gonna match on the sales order ID. It's not gonna work because you know the data type is not matching, right? So you have to do the conversions for those before reading it in here. So that's why I was saying when you did the connection, you have to, when you do the flat file source, you have to make sure that sales order ID is same. So let's say I say the sales order ID is 4-byte integer. So all I need to do is I go in here, and I make one of the columns as integer. So I can do the conversion in here for these ones. So I'm gonna pick DT 4 signed integer, okay, and then I click OK. Once this is done, now I would be able to do a lookup on. It's not going to work fully because I'm just converting one of the columns, not all. So see, I would be able to do it. Now you can pick all the data that you need from here. So it's working the same as lookup. So let's say you need these columns from the txt file, you bring those columns and you click OK. So now your lookup is working. Okay, so you're doing the lookup on the text file basically. You don't want to load, so you're trying to avoid the hassle loading into the database. So let's say you have every time coming a text file from some company and you don't want to load those files every time. All you need to do is for the lookup. So you do this way. Okay. So either you can do the cache transform in the same one, or you can do the cache transform in a separate data flow right before this one. So you can have two data flow and then you do this step in the first one, and in the second one you do this step. So by the time this will start, everything is loaded into the memory, right? So you load first into the memory and then you start the lookup. But if you're doing it parallel, it has to wait until everything gets loaded. So it's going to do the lookup for the matches, and if there is no match, it's going to wait until the file is completely loaded to the memory, because it cannot just say that it's no match found until this is completely read into the memory, right? So and after this, everything is same. Only this step was different, where you, instead of using the OLEDB, you are using the cache connection manager. Okay, is this clear? And now, sorry. Yeah, right. Just the thing is, you are reading from the text file, and before you were reading from the OLEDB connection or from the existing database table. Now, one thing you see in here, you have the option for full cache, partial cache, and no cache. So this is has nothing to do with this one. Don't get confused. So we're gonna deal this separately. So is this clear? Everything will be loaded into the table and it's done. Okay. So what I'm telling you now is a new thing, that is the advanced option for the caching. Okay, and that's just not the cache with this one, it could be something else. So let's say I'm doing a lookup now into the OLEDB manager. Okay, so I'm doing a lookup, let's say in my database on sales order detail table. Okay, sales order detail table. So what is happening right now when you're doing a sales order detail lookup, where this table is getting loaded? It's read from the database, but where it's getting loaded, this table, to do a lookup. So you have some data coming from the source, right, which is from here, and you're doing a lookup on this table, right? You're doing a lookup on this table. So there are two tables, one from the source and one from that you're reading in the lookup, right? So which is one is the available, which is from the source, and one is the lookup table. So this you read into the memory. Where is this going? For doing the lookup, for finding the matches, it's also going into the memory. So both of the table get loaded into the memory, and then it do a transformation lookup thing for you. So it's gonna so both of them get loaded to the memory, and then it does a match. Now what can happen is, if you have two huge tables which has 10 million rows in both, it's gonna be a very slow, and then it can run out of the memory. Then what would you do? When you're doing a lookup and you have huge tables, it can run out of the memory. So on the first tab you go in here, here is the cache mode. So the cache mode, what does it do is, when you do the full cache, it's going to load the whole table, sales order detail table, 10 million rows, into your memory. So that when you have everything loaded into the memory, think about it's going to be fast. But you have to think about, do you have enough resources to load whole table, right? If you don't have, and you have running out of memory for this, then you have to change from full cache to the partial cache. Now what is the partial cache does? Partial cache does is, it's going to load only like partial, so it's going to pull like 10,000 rows. It's going to do a lookup from all the available and see if it finds the record. Then it's going to load another 10,000, another 10,000. So it's going to do a load, and then it says, okay, these rows are not used. It's going to throw out, and it's going to read more. So it's not going to do, so let's say you're doing a row 1 from here to this one. What it's going to do is, it's going to match on the half data set. Then it doesn't found, it throws away, and then brings the another half into the memory, and then do a match. So every time when it's doing a match, it has to flush out every time for doing the partial thing, right? The partial is not necessarily half, it could be like 1/4, 1/3, half, you know. So every time it has to flush the data in order to get the new data from the table. So the sales order table will be detailed table will be loaded in multiple portion, and then it will do a lookup every time from your data source. Okay, so when you have these kind of situation, what's going to happen? It's going to make this performance slow, but it's okay. You're not going to run out of the memory. Okay, does it make sense? So when it will be doing a lookup, it will be doing on a partial set, and then it will take the new partial set, it will do on that, and then it will do on the remaining set. So when you have the memory problem, you have to do partial cache. Now the option is the no cache. When you use the no cache, what's going to happen? Think about. So in the full cache, how many call it's going to make to the database? Only one call, and everything will be loaded into the table. When you do but it's a full speed, right? You know, one call and full speed, but you don't have the resources. You go to the partial cache. When you go to the partial cache, how many calls will be made to the database? Multiples, you know, not a lot, but multiple calls, and then the transformation will be slow. When you do the no cache, what it's going to do? It's going to, for each lookup it's going to make a call to the database for this table, for that particular sales order ID that you're looking up. So think about, if you have 1 million rows, it's going to make 1 million rows to the data, 1 million calls to the database in order to look up all of them, because it's not loading anything into the memory from this table. So if it's not loading anything into the memory into the table, when it has to look sales order ID from here, from the source into this table, how it's going to find it? It's just going to throw each time select star from sales order detail table where sales order ID equals to 1, equals to 2, equals to 3. So it's going to point all 1 million queries to the database. Is that good? That's also not good. The no cache option is not also good, because then you're going to make the number of lookups call, SQL query call to the database. So you try to avoid those. So the no cache is like not a good option at all. I mean, if you have to do, when it's a small table, it's okay. When you're doing a lookup on a table which has 10 rows, that's okay. Then it's going to make only 10 calls to the database. But if you have 1 million rows in here, you're not going to do that. You're going to use the partial cache. I mean, when you have only 10 rows, you just go with the full cache, you know. Everything loaded into the table and done. Yeah. So the no cache comes with a very heavy cost, that your server will be bogged down with the number of calls with the SQL query, the number of lookups you're going to do on the database. So this is the advanced option that I was talking about, these two: connection type and the cache mode. So see, when you do the no cache or the partial cache, this option is already get disabled, because when you're doing the partial cache or full cache, this is not supported. It makes sense, right? Because everything you have to load before, and then only you can do it. So you have to have the full cache. So that's why this option is not supported, because you're doing it in memory and then you say, oh, I want to do the partial cache. How it's going to make sense? How you're going to have the data? Because you're reading from where it's going to make the call to get the data. So that's why this option get disabled, because then it cannot make the call. So that's why. So this cache is only available the full, and that makes sense. Yeah. Right. So I think that's all for the lookup and the cache transformation. And mostly, you know, when you're gonna come across, if you need few of those in here that we not covered, it would be easier to you know, get through those ones, because you know how to use the SSIS. So, but we have covered like the ones that you're gonna use 90% in your 90-95% for the, at least for the data warehouse loading projects and those kind of stuff. SSIS usually used for those. The cleansing project, it's not used a lot because it's slow for those kind of things. But in here also you have a lot of things that are related to the DBA stuff. So all you see in the control flow in the other task, it's all related to data, the DBAs, when you have to do the backups from here, or you have to do like rebuild the indexes, reorganize, shrink the database, transfer database, copying jobs, transferring jobs, everything is in here. But the DBA doesn't use this one. So the SSIS is just not for those. It has other tasks, but the DBA doesn't like this thing, because they can handle, like, they have much control over in the SSMS, you know. So I mean, you have all the tasks when you have to copy. Let's you want to copy all the tables from one database to another. You can have the transfer database task that will copy everything from one database to another, you know, but it's not used a lot for those. So these other tasks are usually for all the related to the DBAs. But other than that, we have almost seen that you're going to use in here. We might talk about one or two in the next class, you know, but other than that, the one that you're gonna use, we already used it. We're gonna talk about the data profiling task in the next class, the bulk insert, analysis processing, few of them in here. Okay, like the emailing task that we didn't cover, FTP task, we can talk about those in the next class. Those are the main ones that are remaining. FTP task, execute process task, data profiling task, bulk insert, these we can talk in the next class. Okay, I think that should be it for today.